Well, good morning and welcome to this second session of the Bretton Woods conference today. It's my great pleasure to co-chair and to moderate this session with Sri Mulyani from the World Bank. As you heard earlier from Jim Wolfenson, we don't give lots of long introductions. Her bio is with you there. Suffice it to say that as the Chief Operating Officer, the Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer for the World Bank Group, she has just about everything at the World Bank under her purview. So she is in a position to really speak with authority about what's happening at the World Bank and where the direction that the bank is going. We're going to begin with a few minutes of remarks by Ms. Mulyani, and then she and I will continue a little dialogue, and then we're going to open it up to you for some questions. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Sri Mulyani.
Thank you. Can I use that
you
audio?
You may speak up there if you prefer.
That will be good. And then I can take a seat after that. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you so much for the introduction, as well as all the participants of the Bretton Woods Committee annual meeting. I want to acknowledge the great work of the committee, and for over 30 years you have been tireless advocate for continued U.S. engagement with the Bretton Woods institution. Your work is definitely very critical to what we do here, and I want to personally thank Congressman Jim Colby, as well as our former President, James Wolfenson, who actually very, very close and always supporting us. The theme that you asked me to speak this morning is about the World Bank priority in a changing development setting. The world today definitely is anything in common with the uncertain war era of the World Bank founding fathers. It is very different from the environment of the Cold War, in which we have two clear centers of power. And even if we look at the global financial crisis in 2008, seems like that moment is distant memory, although I think we still have a lingering impact from that. Let me try to give you a brief overview of the key themes that we have seen emerging over time, as well as affecting our works today. First, as you can see, the center of global economic powers have shifted, and with them, the face of poverty. Middle-income countries are home to 5 of the world's 7 billion population. And over the last 2 decades, together with developing countries, they have emerged as the global engine of growth, representing about a third of global GDP. And this remains true despite the most recent pickup in the US and more or less stability in the euro. Middle-income countries are extremely diverse, with differing development stages and needs. Technically, they are still developing countries, although some of them have substantial economic clout. While they produce the consumers as well as market of tomorrow, they often hurdles to live up to their full potential. Many middle-income countries encounter second-generation challenges that reflect the more advanced stage of their development. They include lifestyle disease, aging population, pension reform, deepening capital and bonds market, lack of financial literacy, low quality of education and skilled labor. It is no longer about the access, but more on the quality, social inequality, competitiveness, trade and tax policy, pollution, and even in this case, the urbanization, which is becoming more and more a problem, and certainly on the governance and institutional capacity building. These are all the issues that those countries want the World Bank to work on with them, whether this is through our lending as well as through our knowledge involvement or sharing. And despite the very remarkable progress among these middle-income countries addressing poverty, we see now that the achievement of halving the poverty since 1990s is already achieved, but the many middle-income countries remain home to 73% of the world's poor people. And in fact, if we are talking about eradicating poverty globally, this country is still struggle in many major areas which I described earlier. The performance of this economy is important, not only for them, but for the rest of the world. I think you just hear from Secretary Liu about this interconnectedness. Many even global advanced economy as well as low-income countries are more and more dependent on the well-being and the continued development and growth of middle-income countries. So despite the encouraging development in many middle-income countries, the focus of the World Bank Group to end poverty is to support low-income countries through our IDA. This is the Fund for the Poorest. Among the 77 countries which are eligible to receive IDA, 36 are in Africa. And poverty there in Africa remains deeper and more intractable than in many middle-income countries. And this is particularly true in many conflict-affected areas, and the goals to end poverty definitely require a more proactive effort, connecting political, security, as well as the economic effort. It's not easy. I just returned just this weekend from my trip to Great Lake region, Rwanda and DRC, which has enormous economic potential, but they linger in a state of vulnerability, insecurity, and extreme poverty. The second theme is the new generation of global risk averse that we encounter. I think the discussion this morning is fit very well. Many developing countries are now well integrated into the global economy and a recipient of capital flow as well as an active players in global trade. This definitely have a positive outcome, but exposes them to new risk. They could feel the pinch from reverse flow once monetary policy here in the United States will tighten further. They could also see higher borrowing costs with shorter maturity and poor economy and an unwelcome development after several years of many of them relying or having a first initial access to global capital market. Another risk is slowing growth in China, which is affecting many countries who depend on raw material export. Low and volatility of commodity prices, including food, as well as the drop in oil price and mining commodities, pose significant burden for some exporters. We already see countries like Angola, Kazakhstan, Colombia reaching out to us and looking for assistance to bridge not only their fiscal gap and also to support their effort to diversify their economy away from oil and mineral. And then we also see the transnational threat, like the impact of climate change, terrorism, and infectious disease. So what are the implications for us at the World Bank Group? How do we see these new clients and their new need and their risks and how it will affect our priority? To put it simply, in changing world, we have to change too. But the question is if our ambition will be adequate for the change required. Are we ready for the diversity of our clients, their individual needs, and their evolving challenges? I believe we are, and we can continue to be so in the future. Let me be clear. This is not about competition for relevance. We are not making a case to keep our job. I believe something much bigger is at stake. The truth is that getting over the finishing line for ending poverty cannot be done solely with traditional government aid. While it remained important, it takes the private sectors and domestic resource mobilization to fund the knowledge we need to make it happen. And it takes international cooperation through institutions like the World Bank Group. Many of the issues that cause poverty don't respect borders. Volatile capital flow and commodity prices, disease like Ebola, violent weather, money laundering, corruption, conflict and displacement, as we currently witness in the Mediterranean, as well as the coast of Indonesia and Thailand, or even when I was in Rwanda, what is happening in Burundi. None of this problem can be solved by a single country. The World Bank is the most multilateral organization we have, and for our shareholder, including, of course, our largest owners of this institution, the United States, the bank is the body in which they jointly promote good governance, sound global principle, and collective or shared prosperity. Development and progress are not just good for one country, but serving as a global public good for whole region, as well as the global community that will benefit from it. The ability of the World Bank to influence the way countries achieve economic growth, fight poverty, promote shared prosperity, and protect the environment depend on our financial strength, our knowledge, and our people, but also our credibility as the partner of choice to solve difficult and complex development issues. Whether we promote and facilitate trade and regional integration in landlocked countries like Uganda and Rwanda, or when we are working in Haiti to rebuild after the earthquake, and Latin America to improve productivity and competitiveness, or help Nigeria to improve governance and investment climate to promote more private investment, or in my own country, Indonesia, where the bank is supporting the design of safety net that we can then overhaul expensive fuel subsidy without hurting the poor people. But also through our cooperation with the new player like ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is just questioned or discussed on the previous session. Regardless of what we do, we can help countries to turn their challenges into opportunity. We can enable the world to expand, and we can create solutions with our clients that are good for them and their people, but also for our shareholders who depend on these new players as market as well as partners in development. So coming back to the theme, the World Bank's priority in changing development setting, I think it is more and more clear the bank will only play a key role in making differences if our priorities overlap with the priority of our client as well as our shareholder. Thank you very much.
Well, Ms. Miljani, thank you very much for that very clear explanation and outlining some of the priorities for the World Bank. Let me start with a kind of a fundamental question that I think stems from what you were just discussing. Would you perhaps give us a little bit more background in how you see the World Bank changing its organization, its structure, in order to meet these changing priorities? What is the thinking about what has to be done internally in the bank to change in order to meet these new priorities that you discussed of the emerging economies becoming the really drivers of the economic engine in the future?
Yeah. I think from what I presented earlier, we see many of our clients shifting in terms of their demand and the need. And the way we approach and how to serve them in the past, which is really focusing on more the regional approach, is no longer becoming more relevant than today, in which they want to learn from across the globe. Let's say I was in Rwanda and we discussed, and they are now talking about the urbanization. We just finished the urbanization study in China. As you all know, the transition of China into a more domestic demand growth models, more sustainable, will really depend on how they are going to reorganize on their urbanization. I think comparing Rwanda, which is 11 million, with China, 1.4 billion, is something which is maybe you should not doing it. But definitely there are so many principles there which still apply. Whether you're talking about the design of the urban, so the urban planner, you're talking about local government finance, we are talking about service delivery, there are certain principles which is still the same. So with the new organization that the bank now is doing, is actually we try to look at our client more as a unique in their need, but at the same time applying a lot of knowledge that we capture and we can get from our presence, as well as engagement with many of the clients, so that they can get what is the best both knowledge and development experience. That will require us to change in terms of the way we organize internally within the bank. But the change of the bank is not only the way that we are organize ourselves through what we call it global practice to deepen our technical knowledge, but at the same time able to serve clients. We are also doing and change ourselves in terms of the way we allocate resource, that is on a budgeting process, that is going to be more consistent with the goal and priority and strategy that we are having. At the first time in the bank that we are now is doing and discussing about budget in a much more transparent and consistent way. We are cutting our budget in order for us to make sure that we are efficient, but also allocate to the highest priority. That will make us consistent when we are telling the country, for example, like we are talking in Rwanda, or I just visited Tunisia, that they are going to change their public finance. I was finance minister before. We changed a lot of our reform in the way we manage our state finance through what we call it the best practice globally. But I think the bank is just right for us to also adopting the same thing. So we are changing because we want to adopt the same good governance and sound principle here internally within the bank.
So is this an ongoing process, or would you say most of this has already been put in place? Are we still continuing this process of changing the structure and the thinking and the operation of the World Bank?
I think most of the change is already being implemented. Some of it we have to make sure that we are going to now have to fine-tune, overcome the teething problem because of change of the structure, as well as the adjustment of, in terms of the budgeting process. So this fiscal year is the first fiscal year in which we implement through this new budget system as well as our structure. But I think more or less the change is already there. So we are just fine-tuning.
You've talked about twin goals of ending poverty and promoting shared prosperity. How do those two goals fit into what you've just been talking about, and what is the bank doing to meet those two, and is there any inconsistency between them?
Well, I think for the two goals, we look at the map of the poverty globally, and we definitely see that the concentration of the poor, of course in Africa, but also in South Asia. There is always a dilemma in this case, because if you look at India, they are so now, especially under the new leadership, they can claim that they are going to have a very impressive economic growth. But still, within that country, you are still finding a huge pocket of poverty, even in China. So many of what I'm saying earlier is that a lot of poor is actually whether they live in the middle income country or they are concentrated in Africa or low income country or fragile state. In middle income country, the way we operate is going to be different because that country have their own resource. At least they are now having a growing middle class. They have domestic resources. They have some capacity, especially at the central level. But they can face some of the pocket of poverty in the lag-behind region within their countries. That's happened in China, in the inland, in India, or even in my own country, or in Brazil, we have Pernambuco on the northern side, Mexico. We are not going to do exactly the same like if we are going to do and approaching the poverty in Mali or in South Sudan or Somalia in this case. So the way we are now looking at these two goals, especially on the poverty side, how we are going to use the experience that we have, and at the same time, partnering with their country in order for them to enable themselves to address the issue of poverty. Some of our operation in middle-income country is through the decentralized local government rather than the central level, which is more or less they have a capacity. But in many low-income fragile states, our operation is going to be more like hand-holding. The presence of the bank staff, as well as our ability to continue support, is going to be very critical in that. Shared prosperity inequality is the biggest issue, I think, everywhere, even in an advanced country. And to be honest with you, this is the area which, whether you are going to measure it in terms of Gini coefficient or you are going to do like the bottom 40% vis-a-vis the average growth. But we see that some of the countries who enjoy high performance growth, not necessarily that they are having an inclusive process. Or in this case, they are fully aware in addressing the widening gap of this inequality. So the challenge is about some very basic about public performance, that is public services to the poor people especially, or up to the level of the tax capacity of the tax to actually mobilize the fund and doing what is the right expenditure design that will address this inequality. So this is the area that the bank tried to address through our, not only the way we try to focus on these two goals, measuring it, aligning with what we are doing, but also resource allocation as well as the way we operate is going to be hopefully consistent with those priorities.
When you talk about the middle-income countries and the shared prosperity, the differentials in a place like China or India or even the northeastern region of Brazil versus the rest, and we talk about trying to increase shared prosperity. Do you run into particular problems in those countries, political problems or others, resistance from certain parts of either economic groups or from the government?
Definitely. I think the issue sometimes is more on the design of the fiscal policy in a way that is going to link the expenditure spending with the performance of that. But more or less sometimes it's also related to the elite capture, or in this case, the reform in state-owned enterprises. I guess there is always a challenge for many of these countries to create the right, what you call it, policy framework. Most of the countries have a good, sound macroeconomic policy because I think many countries learned from 1980s debt problem in Latin America or financial crisis in Asia back in the late 1990s. Many of them has already adopted what you call it fiscal responsibility law, so that is actually minimizing the risk of exceeding their fiscal deficit. But I think they are still having and suffering the structural problem, whether this is related to corruption, governance, or even purely capacity building. Many of the countries still actually at the very early. If they have a very good capacity, there sometimes is a very thin layer at the top level or very centralized in the capital, but not in the local government. So this kind of thing, which is, I think, creating a combination of capacity building, strengthening of adopting the sound policy, which is already maybe put in their law, but not being implemented consistently because of their capacity building, as well as sometimes resisting some of the elite capture.
I have other questions that I could think of to ask you, but I want to allow some time for the audience, and I'm hoping that the comments that you have made will stimulate some questions about the World Bank and its policies and procedures. So if we have some questions, please raise your hand and we'll try and take them. Please, wait for the microphone and do identify yourself. We'll start with Paul over here and then over here and there. Okay.
Good morning. I'm Paul Applegarth. Thank you very much for your remarks. You mentioned that the bank had recognized that it could not be the sole source of funding and that the private sector could had provided and was providing potentially much more in terms of capital. I'm curious what concrete steps the bank has taken to promote those flows, what steps it's taking to make sure that its own operations don't preempt those flows, and then both looking at that and other things, what standards is the bank set so that, say, 5 years from now, you know you've made progress against those goals or you've achieved those goals?
Should I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the one very concrete is the doing business. Many of our work in a client country is really based on whether they have the indicator that can be measured in improving their investment climate. And that will be from simplifying the procedural. They have a one-roof policy in terms of the investment, as well as improving more on their capacity to not only support but also approve any of the investment application, both domestically and internationally. We also work in addressing the issue of the bottleneck in infrastructure, which is actually one of the biggest bottleneck for many private sector to come. We also have to address sometimes the trade policy because, for example, like landlocked country like Rwanda, Uganda, they really depend on how they are going to be connected with Kenya or even with Tanzania. So basically, when we are talking about private sector and the resource from both government-owned resources as well as ODA, we use that as a more catalytic role or catalytic force in order to unleash their own potential. And that is really related for the policy framework up to the institutional building, up to even investment in the infrastructure in order for us to be able to help them in building the good private sector. I think the second question about measuring whether the change. First, within the bank, the change which is related to the efficiency and resource. We just want to make sure after do a very deep diagnostic about what is the area that we see as an inefficient by doing the benchmarking with the other institution, although IFIs or maybe even private sector and development institution. Then we try to lock in that into the internal management process. That, in terms of the discussion on resources, the ratio of staff to the load, or in this case, even in terms of our operation globally, that is the global footprint, our decentralized office, how their performance that can be benchmarked based on the load as well as the challenge that they are having. We will lock that into the management contract internally, cascading from President Kim to myself to all the vice president and then to their directors. We are linking that into the performance, that is what is need to be achieved. Of course, the bank have both the IBRD and the IDA, and the allocation of resource as well as the knowledge work that we are having is going to be linked to what is the goal that they try to achieve through that countries. There is a tools like the scorecard that we are applying. So that is the mechanism that we are trying to make sure that the management is going to be consistent with the goal and strategy and then the resource and daily decision-making process.
Thank you. We have a question here and then one behind, and then back over on this side.
My name is Martin Apple. I have lived in quite a number of countries around Africa, more or less all the way around the equator. And I dealt with the ministers of agriculture, ministers of education, and from that top-down view, I could see a lot of wonderful things we could do. And then I would go out into the rice fields and be knee-deep and see the complete opposite world. Let's take your case, Rwanda. If I were to look from the bottom of Rwanda up, I would see a lot of very poor people who are facing a competition between growing tobacco and food with a very limited reserve of water, which is getting smaller, and competing with plantations, which will not make most of the poor any wealthier, and build them in any way. If you invest in Rwanda in terms of a strategy, wouldn't it be the appropriate thing to try and figure out something catalytic where whatever you accomplish there could be as an example to others around it?
Well, I'm glad you really raised this issue because I just visited Rwanda last week, and I think the agriculture is the area in which we are now working with the government as well as the local government and the farmer. I mean, this is the country in which you have 1,000 hills, so the land is not like flat like in Indonesia, although part of Indonesia is the same. But one of our study by our chief economist in sub-Saharan Africa is telling that the transformation of the Africa toward more middle and industrial country is not really following, or at least the progress is not as fast as in Asia because of the design of many of the agriculture policy is not really creating, and then you are trying to link with the urbanization in order for us to be able to create more productive activity, high value added for their labor, which is not going to be captured in the agriculture sector, low productivity, informal, abundance of labor in agriculture, you are shifting to more industrialized manufacturing. But that will require a design in a way that you have to make sure that the agriculture sector is not going to be just abundant, but they are going to make it more productive. And in Rwanda case, definitely that's related to the way they are using the land. Many of the land cannot be planted because of very hill. And that's why we do what we call it the terracing with them. And then that will link to their capacity to manage the water resources, which is very critical in the past because this is hilly that they are just rain plenty, adequate there, but they are not capturing and managing it. So a combination of both land management, the irrigation, as well as on the input that is fertilizer and seed, then connected with the private sector, we like to have the IFC to come, so link it that to the market, investing in a rural road, link it to the city, and within the city of Rwanda, you have to be connected with Uganda and Kenya in order for them to be able to export. I mean, this is no longer Rwanda owned, but we try to work with the other neighboring country, and this is maybe a much more challenging because you are dealing with sometimes regional project that will require multiple countries to agree. We are in Niger, in which we have Kandaji Dam. This is also another, the riparian countries, 6, 7 of them have to agree. That kind of thing that now the bank is use our limited resource and we are not using our own resource. In that kind of particular project, we sometimes co-finance or parallel financing. In fact, today we are going to discuss one of the Ethiopia in which we are going to have Korean, Chinese, and World Bank to actually finance one, again, Ethiopia is a landlocked country, the road that will link them to their port, which is with the neighboring country. So that kind of thing, which I think we use the limited resource of the bank, sometimes not only building the infrastructure as a separate project, but we link it to the both policy and then how to make sure that there is a policy framework, sometimes not only in one country, but across country that is in the regional country, so that they will then have a much bigger impact for not only that community, but to the country and the region, or even sometimes globally.
Thank you. I think we only have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to try to get one in here, one there. Maybe if I can get a third one. If they're quick and the answers are quick, we can get 3 in here.
Hi, I'm Jean-Louis Sarbib. I'm a former senior vice president here at the World Bank. And I really appreciate the fact that in the changing times that you have described, the bank needed to change. However, having followed the change process over the last 3 years, I think it is fair to say that many of us who have devoted our lives to the bank are very concerned. We're concerned about the way in which these changes have been taking place. We're concerned about the fact that they don't seem to have a real clear objective, as witnessed recently by the reorganizations of the reorganization. And I think that they have led to words that I did not used to hear at the World Bank. Words like fear, retaliation, lack of trust. And I wonder what senior management is trying to do to really regain the trust of people who are committed to the mission of the organization. And without this trust, it's very difficult for the organization to meet the challenges that you have so ably described. So on behalf of many people who have spent their life at the World Bank, I want to express the concern that we have of how the reorganization has taken place, how it has been managed, and of the impact that it has had and is continued to have on the staff morale and their commitment and trust in the organization. Thank you.
Well, you may want to comment on that. It wasn't really a question, but you may want to comment or not comment as you choose.
Well, I just want a very short comment. The change is really radical in this institution. And I do understand, based on my own experiences, we can always manage it better. But when you change the organization, definitely there is the cost in terms of the trust. And you maybe remember that the bank was organized in a way that we are moving more on the regional side and we are becoming a global practice. But this institution is still organized as a matrix organization, as a combination between the operation facing to our client, that is country and regional base, with our technical depth. And that will require the trust and confidence between the two sides of the matrix. There is no way that you are going to have a matrix organization if the trust between the two sides of the matrix is being restored or breached. And we are trying to now rebuild that because the change process, that changed a lot in terms of the perception of the two sides of the matrix. We could handle it better, certainly. We're trying by providing and building the culture of more openness and transparency of the decision-making process, whether this is on the resources, whether this is in terms of appointment, as well as how we are going to measure performance, so that the discussion is no longer becoming personalized or subjective, but really based on what we try to achieve as an organization. It is really difficult. I must say, I also see that having joined the bank only in the past 5 years, I was a client before. I actually jokingly saying to all my colleagues here, if the client really see internally within the bank that we organize this way, I think we are not going to have enough confidence to actually facing or advising our client to do their own reform. But I know that reform is always painful. I do hope that we can address the issue of this, what you call uncertainty, in a much quicker. But what we are doing in terms of reforming the budget process, organizing ourselves in a way that we can capture and strengthening our knowledge, but at the same time not sacrificing our ability to engage with clients, because so many clients still need our presence. And to be honest, to focus on what we try to achieve rather than actually quarreling about internal the bank. That will energize staff. I visited staff, I discussed with staff here. They always energize when we talk about the work. And this is what we, the senior management, now try to rebuild that.
I'm afraid we'll try to, if it's very short, we'll take one final question here.
Hello, my name is Harut Samuelian. I am from Lebanon. I'm the Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon. As you know, there are a lot of resources in the Middle East that, if used properly, would benefit the entire world and reduce poverty in so many aspects. What is the strategy of the World Bank under this changing environment and changing situation in the Middle East and the Gulf, where resources are being wasted, destroyed, and unutilized? I really would like to know the World Bank strategy for the future in this issue. Thank you.
Well, this is really a big question, but I would say that I just visited Tunisia and Egypt a month ago. And I must say that for this region, who has a lot of resources, definitely, but unevenly distributed. This is the region which is less integrated. If you are talking about infrastructure, trade, investment policy, they are more connected with the rest of the world rather than among themselves. So the bank is not the one and the only institution who can solve the problem. At the end, it is really the government there who really have to solve many of their very fundamental problems. But we will support the strategy as well as the program or the priority of the government. We will try to provide what is the experience of other region facing with this kind of similar situation, whether on the natural resource management, so that's related to the public finance management, whether this is related to the trade integration, whether they are going to build interconnectedness in terms of the electricity, road, or other infrastructure. I think that's what we're trying to do. If they're discussing about the Arab Spring, and it's related to labor youth, especially with maybe mismatch of the skill. We are now working hard to focus on education, whether this is related to the education at the more on the formal education or more on the vocational. That is the area that we will support. So more on the quality and providing more with the skill type. We work with the IFC in order for us to be able to make sure that it is connected with the labor market. We also work with the IFC in order to develop more on their own financial system and deepening of their capital market, because that is the area in which you have a lot of resource, but they cannot be invested according to what they're doing. So that is the area that we work with the other partner, but most importantly, of course, we have to work with the government there in order for them to be able to lay or to build the right foundation for them to create more prosperity and share it with all their people there.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Shri Mulyani for her very candid, forthright comments.